Welcome, everyone. My name is Josh Campbell. I'm the CEO of Clara Media. Clara Media is made up of Techonomy, CDX, and now the Worth magazine brand. So thanks for joining us today for this timely conversation. As I mentioned, we have the poll up. Please take a minute to fill out the poll before we take that down so we can refer to some of the results. If you have questions or want to make comments, please use the chat function. We will be chatting with participants who have questions and comments, seeing potentially even bringing them onto the stage throughout the next hour. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks to Huawei for partnering with us on this conversation. And I'll hand it over to David to moderate the conversation.
Thank you, Josh. And hello and welcome, everybody. We have a good crowd, and it's a global crowd. I see people who are in France and other parts of Asia, etc., around the country. It's an interesting topic. I think we're going to find it's a little bit fraught, and it's possibly going to surprise you, some of the things you may hear today. People have very strong views when you start talking about US-China relations in general and tech relations in particular. We had somebody unsubscribe to our email list just this morning just because we mentioned Huawei. Somebody else told us we were selling out to have this discussion. People do have strong views. But I would say that the US-China relationship in general is one of the most important things that all of us have to understand and that the US has to wrestle with as a country and as a people for the foreseeable future. And so it's our belief at Techonomy that dialogue is always valuable. And the more dialogue you can have, the more you're going to understand the issues. And in this case, in particular. And so we're tech people, so we're going to have a dialogue today about the tech side of this fraught conflict. It is an odd situation. I'll just say a few more introductory words. That it's widely accepted that 5G is the most important infrastructure for the future of societies globally. And in the case of Huawei, the US has boxed out the most capable company in the world in that arena. There are other very capable companies, including Ericsson, that we have worked with, as many of you'll know. But Huawei has more patents, more engineers working on this stuff, and in the opinion of many, has the most sophisticated capabilities. So they're not in the US, they're not going to be in the US by all the evidence, and there is no US alternative. Ericsson and Nokia, big players, are both European. The other major player is Samsung, which of course is Korean. In the meantime, so we are not just talking about Huawei, we're talking about the massive issues around US-China tech relations, but because we have a very senior Huawei representative, we are going to be talking about that, and Huawei is co-sponsoring this with Techonomy, which we're very happy about. And the fact is that the US government has imposed major restrictions, predominantly under the Trump administration, but that most of which are being retained as of now by the Biden administration, on what American companies can supply to Huawei. And those restrictions have been significant enough that it affected Huawei's results in a negative way. They're still growing. They're still very profitable, big company, but they are not growing at the pace they were because chips and specifically the Android operating system are now being denied them in certain key instances. Well, they do still get some American stuff, but not everything that they would like. And Joy can possibly explain that in more detail. Huawei has virtually no US presence at the moment, except with a small number of mostly rural telecommunications companies that have bought its equipment over the years, but are in many cases even now removing it. Large US telecom companies are not allowed to use Huawei equipment. And increasingly, the restrictions are growing in Europe, notably the UK, which relied very heavily on Huawei and is moving away from that. So let me quickly introduce the panelists. I mentioned Joy. Joy Tan is Senior Vice President, Huawei Communications USA, and somebody who's been to some of our sessions as a panelist, not as a panelist, as a visitor and asking questions at sessions. And we are very happy to have gotten to know her and now to be working together on this session. I don't see the same view you guys see. I am going to try to get a better view of, oh, there we go. I can see people larger now. Zachary Carabell is an author. I called him a pundit in one of our promo things. He's a very widely known, he's written a ton of books. He has a book coming out in just a month or so about Brown Brothers Harriman, which is a history of a major Wall Street firm. I know he was just recording the audio version of that this week when I was talking to him. But one of the reasons we asked him to join this session is that in 2009, he wrote a book and published it called Superfusion, How the US and China Became One Economy, and some other thing in subtitle. But it's really about the fusion of economies. And he's thought a lot about US-China relations, as you'll see. Scott Malcolmson is also a journalist and an author who, like Zachary, is a good friend of Techonomies, and wrote a book in 2015 called, what was it called? Oh, Splinternet, thank you. And it's really about the fragmentation of the global internet as countries particularly take more and more divergent views about how they want to connect with the rest of the world. And he's also a very deep thinker on foreign and US relations. He was the foreign affairs editor of New York Times Magazine at one point. He was also the speechwriter for the US representative to the United Nations at one time. He's done a lot of interesting things, very capable things. So we have three really, really eminent panelists who are very knowledgeable. So maybe, Joy, it would be good for you to start. Wait, actually, let's just share the poll before we get started. I always forget to do that. Okay, I'll end the poll if that's, and I'll share the results. Okay, somebody else is doing that for me. So what approach should the US take for cybersecurity? Block companies from certain countries. Only 16% of you answered positively to that. That's interesting. I'm sure Joy would find that gratifying. Comprehensively test equipment, 35%. Establish rules that apply to all companies regardless of their country. That's what the large number of you said. Work with Europe on collaborative Western technologies. Establish global policy and technology bodies for ongoing dialogue, including China. That's the leading answer. And in some ways, that is the case. It's just that the US isn't normally participating in them that effectively at the moment because they do include China. But places like the ITU, which is a group that I work with quite a bit, does do that. Is it possible to disentangle the interdependent US-China supply chain? Overwhelmingly, this audience believes the answer to that is no. Should the US use Huawei technology for its 5G networks? You're fairly split on that. Only 36% of you say an absolute no. That's quite an open-minded group. I think we have an unrepresentatively open-minded group, perhaps. I hope not, but I think we have, maybe you're a more open-minded group than certainly than if it was Congress people, that would not be that result. What will be the long-term impact of US restrictions against Huawei? It will hurt both. That's what you say. What is the main motivation? Security. That probably is a legitimately fair answer, at least, but we'll see what that may come up in the discussion. So, Joy, give us a quick picture of where US-Huawei relations stand now.
David, thank you for having me. Just a quick overview of the US restriction on Huawei. I think mostly on three areas. First of all, we cannot procure any US technology products, either hardware, software, or any technology from US companies. And recently, well, actually August last year, that got expanded to companies like Taiwan Semiconductor, who has used US technology to manufacture chips for Huawei. So we cannot actually buy anything from Taiwan Semiconductor. Or companies like that. And so that's the restriction on products, chips, Android, Google platforms, and any other US components. I think secondly is about the US rural carriers. We have about 40 rural carriers in the US. They're the tier 3, tier 4 carriers that provide telecommunication services in very remote areas like Oregon or Arkansas. They right now have to take out Huawei's gears from their existing network. So is under process. And then, of course, the U.S. government agencies or their contractors and subcontractors cannot use any Huawei related equipment. So, we originally didn't have too much business in the U.S. anyway, so that doesn't impact Huawei too much. But overall, the restriction is on the supply chain for Huawei. And so I think that's just has great impact on Huawei's global business and also the US semiconductor industry and US companies.
So I was wrong when I said there were some exceptions to that, because I thought at a certain point there were some things that were being allowed with special approval, but that's not even the case.
Yeah, if companies apply for special approval, they can, if the government approves that, so they can sell.
But that is happening now. Like I think Micron is able to sell you some things now, if I understand correctly. Is that right?
I think there are certain companies who have got licenses. I don't have the specific names of these companies.
Well, why do you step to one level higher before we go to the other panelists and talk about how you see the state of U.S.-China tech tensions and where it's headed and what its impact is and may be going forward?
I think just from Huawei's perspective, I think is a disruption of the global supply chain, especially on the semiconductor supply chain. In US and China, in terms of semiconductor supply chain, is extremely intertwined from manufacturing relationship, finance, and talent and all that. So I think this is a huge disruption. I think that caused some of the chip shortage we see right now. And of course, there's going to be short-term and long-term impact. And the short-term impact is the revenue on these US chip makers like Intel, Qualcomm, Micron, all these companies. And the long-term impact is the competitive edge of these US semiconductor companies. So, we can talk more after we get into these specific topics, but just in general, there are short-term and long-term impacts on the global supply chain.
Thanks. So we'll come back to a lot of these points. Scott, I wanted to go to you because I know you have specifically studied, particularly maybe not in the US, but other countries, how Huawei and Chinese companies are supplying those nations that are generally US allies in some instances. But just what's your perspective on the big picture here of what we are doing in terms of restricting US technology to Huawei and some other companies, and what the long-term ramifications of that are?
Thank you. Hi, David, Zachary, Joy, nice to see you all. So, I mean, I guess I would start with one point, which is kind of the inverse of some of your introduction. So Chinese policy has really been towards self-sufficiency, and it became increasingly towards self-sufficiency after Donald Trump was elected president. That I think is the main driver of all of this. The US has blocked Huawei really pretty much forever, and particularly after 2012, when there was a big report basically saying that it represented a threat to American security. So as you say, Huawei hasn't really been much of a presence in the US really ever, but it's been a huge presence around the world. This drive towards self-sufficiency basically works in the following way. China is able to generate tech companies, provides a protected market of a quarter of the world, give or take. And they're able to grow in that protected market, compete against each other in a relatively controlled fashion until they're able to go into foreign markets. Huawei was distinct from ZTE, which is sort of its main competitor among the big Chinese companies, ZTE being state-owned. Huawei had to go overseas earlier And basically Huawei and ZTE between them built a great deal of the tech infrastructure around the world. And in most importantly, perhaps in the poorer markets, Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, where the companies you mentioned, Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung, basically didn't give that much competition. So the self-sufficiency aspect of this is very important because what China is doing now is providing its companies an opportunity to roll out 5G and everything, and improve their capabilities and make them stronger when they go into the international marketplace. American companies, most foreign companies, most non-Chinese companies are not able to compete freely for that Chinese market and never have been. And so, you know, when I mean, the audience is saying that the decoupling is impossible. Decoupling to a degree has really been China's policy with technology and many other things for a number of years. And it seems to be going more that way. So, I mean, one question I'd love to ask Joy is what Huawei's business plan is for those parts of the world that where Huawei and ZTE have been the dominant builders of telecoms infrastructure. I mean, in given current U.S. policy, given that the Biden administration doesn't seem to be departing from Trump administration policy on technology specifically, where is Huawei going to find its consumers? Is it going to continue in Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia, Central Asia? Is it going to try to force a change in American policy and in European policy, Japanese policy, South Korean policy, Taiwanese policy, all of which basically exclude Huawei specifically, but a lot of other Chinese tech companies as well from their infrastructure? How does Huawei take its business forward in the next, say, 2 to 3 years or 10 years?
So Huawei has a broad portfolio. We have the carrier business, which is about 30–40% of our overall portfolio, and then the consumer business, and then enterprise cloud business. So last year, the carrier business remained pretty much stable from 2019. Our consumer business dropped because we cannot use Google mobile services on our devices. A lot of countries in Europe, outside of China, they use Google platforms, so that impacted our consumer sales significantly. But our enterprise business grew 23% year on year. So that's cloud, and services, especially in China. So I think because of the broad portfolio, we can continue to grow in the infrastructure and consumer and cloud business. And additionally, Huawei is investing heavily into the automotive industry. We're building connectivity modules and batteries for these electric cars. So that's another area for potential revenue in the pretty fast actually. Years to come. And then of course, in addition to smart devices, we're building an entire ecosystem, not just around the smart devices. So we call it 1+A+N strategy in the consumer space. So there are wearable devices, there are computers and consumer electronics around the smartphones. So Huawei's Chinese market has become the biggest part of our overall portfolio. In the past, it was about 50% of global revenue, but last year it grew to 65% of the global revenue. So China still represents a huge market, either on the infrastructure and consumer space. So there are many areas Huawei can continue to grow.
Thank you, Joy. And it should be said that in much of the developing world, Huawei and other Chinese companies, but especially Huawei, is overwhelmingly dominant in installing telecommunications infrastructure. And I assume that is likely to remain the case. So Zachary, take it anywhere you want from here. I could come up with questions, but knowing you probably don't need a question.
Well, there's a difference between need and want, which I guess is also a metaphor for this whole discussion about the United States, the internet, China, and Huawei. So look, Scott's totally correct that when he wrote Splinternet, that reality has become even more entrenched as a reality, and in many ways, I think stems initially from a Beijing and a Chinese government desire to, at least in areas of artificial intelligence, cyber, and telecommunications, to be relatively independent of or inviolable, whether it's the building of an intranet or the Great Chinese Firewall. I don't think China is any different than any other major power. I mean, the fact is most countries define sovereignty by the ability to resist coercion from other sovereign entities, and the United States is equally interested in that and has had its own export controls and dual use equipment restrictions on all sorts of things for decades, right? So a lot of this is not, it's not a Huawei or even Chinese technology phenomenon. It's countries that will desire, particularly for national security, and cyber and communications have always been seen as part of a national security nexus, just like telephony and phones were, right? In the 1970s, part of the reason for a telephony monopoly for AT&T was perceived to be a national security one until it wasn't. So I mean, again, I just want to frame that because it's easy to get to feel like there's something particularly unique here about about the China issue, rather than there is a context where nations like to do this, and this is the iteration of it in the China-US context. Then there's the China-US one. First, and I'm not saying this as either a critique or a defense of Huawei, a lot of that desire to be totally separate and autonomous stemmed from Beijing's desire, basically because one of its great vulnerabilities, or perceived vulnerabilities, would be using American equipment or someone else's equipment for their own internal infrastructure. And again, this contest, particularly given that in wanting to do that, there was an early iteration in the aughts, in the 2000s, where not just Huawei, but ZTE and a lot of other companies did appropriate both American and European intellectual property to build out the initial structure of those networks. So, one of the early versions of this was a major case involving 3Com, which was a major telecom provider in the early 2000s. Then you get to today, and the question is, one, are the concerns, right, that somehow a Chinese telecom equipment manufacturer like Huawei is going to take directives from the Chinese Communist Party and embed backdoor either hardware or some combination of hardware and software that would allow for intercepting communications that would otherwise not be interceptable. And I just I think that's a really important caveat, right? Because what matters is not, are the Chinese spying on us? Are we spying on China? It's, does the production and the location of the production of the equipment provide some sort of competitive intelligence spying advantage? And I think there the question is widely asked and not sufficiently answered, meaning the accusations made. But I just wanted to frame that in the context, right? Which is, not all of this is quite as China-US as it would appear. And there's a trajectory. The Splinternet part we can get into more, of wanting really separate communications regimes, is unique to kind of the internet and the web and the ability to try to carve those out. So that's where I took your complete open-ended invitation to
Okay,
go
good.
anywhere.
Let me ask you one less open-ended thing. How would you assess the effectiveness of US policy in this regard right now?
Well, first of all, I'm not 100% clear what the actual goals of US policy are. If the goal is, we are going to prevent China from having a domestic set of companies that can create, produce, and export equipment that we want to produce, create, and export, and do so competitively, the only thing that's succeeded in terms of US policy to date is to crimp the ability of Huawei and some other companies to function. It hasn't actually led the United States to be able to produce equivalent equipment at equivalent cost. So if the goal is, we're going to prevent them and boost us, there's some prevention and very little boosting, because it's never been married to an effective domestic policy of how do we make sure that whatever equipment we are domestically either generating versus intellectual property and then producing, or Ericsson for that matter, which is obviously not an American company, but which we are more comfortable doing business with. So there's been no success on we are going to create an equivalent set of producers and manufacturers. If the policy is, by doing this, we are somehow going to coerce the Chinese government to act differently because the costs of not acting differently are so great, that's also been a complete failure, because that leverage is insufficient. And then there's just the complete muddiness of it, which is, oh, the U.S. can do this because it's done this. It can, try to put pressure on allies not to buy certain equipment. It can try to use the Treasury Department to extend the sanctions regime in ways that are highly questionable in terms of an infringement of other countries' sovereignty, and creates immense animosity toward the United States. So I also think that the policy is deeply muddled.
Okay, just to go to 180 degrees from my opening, I'm going to put back in your mouth some words that you told me on the prep call, and tell me, you said the trade-off is a potential vulnerability to Beijing espionage, which you emphasized the potential, or falling 5 to 10 years behind in 5G and the next generation of cellular technology. So is that what you would say again here?
Look, the United States is not making the equipment that it could buy from Huawei. Ericsson does make some of it, and so do some other companies that you've mentioned, but not at the same cost and not always at the same capability. So we've got this whole 5G rollout. We're auctioning off spectrum in order to build it out, and every major telecom has major capital spending projects, which it will do, but at a slower pace and with inadequate technology. And that is in fact the trade-off that we've chosen, which is that the rollout of 5G in the United States will be much slower and much more costly. Yeah. And there's been no effort to actually adjust for that in pursuing the Huawei, ZTE, et cetera policy.
Okay, good. Scott, and I've got a bunch of questions for you too, Joyce, so feel free to reply to any of this when I come to you. But, Zachary touched briefly on this issue of what the real risks are of Chinese network infrastructure in the US. What has been shown to be the risks as far as you can tell?
So, I would really look to a story about a week or so ago. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the store called H&M. H&M had an announcement that was a year old, but anyway, new attention was drawn to it, basically saying that H&M was unwilling to source materials from Xinjiang because of the repression of the Chinese state policy in the province of Xinjiang. So when that happened, within days of that happening, Didi, which is sort of the Uber of China and of many other places, Meituan, Baidu's the major search engine, they just deplatformed H&M from the Chinese market, so that on one day you could get on your phone and say, show me the directions to get to the H&M store in Beijing, and then the next day you would do that, and it was as though the store didn't exist. That's the kind of power that the Chinese government is more than willing to exercise with any Chinese company, even over the matter of a European retailer having misgivings about the sources of some of its inputs. So I actually don't think it's all that relevant a question. Espionage occurs regardless of what anybody does. In some ways, Huawei's systems were insecure enough that it made it easier to conduct espionage into Huawei networks than into other rival companies' networks.
Is that in the past or in the present?
Oh, I think that's still true. So to me, the main question, and I think it's already been answered, and it was answered a week ago, is will the Chinese government influence Chinese multinational companies, tech companies, to carry out its will? And I think the answer is yes.
Okay, and Joy, that tees up one of the questions I definitely wanted to ask you, and that is, it's often said in justifying restrictions on Huawei in particular, Chinese equipment in the US, or basically Chinese technology in general in the US and in the West, that a recent law in China was passed that requires all companies to basically take instructions from the state in the case of national security instances to do whatever they ask. So is that correct, as it's often said? And what is that law? How would it affect you?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings and misinterpretations about the law. I think there are two main areas about the law. One, actually, I had this in front of me. It says this is about a national intelligence article. It says all organizations and citizens shall, in accordance with the law, support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence work and keep confidential the secrets of national intelligence work that come to his or her knowledge. The state shall protect organizations and individuals that support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence work. So this article explicitly states that support, assistance, and cooperation with by organization in accordance with the law. There's no Chinese law right now that that's authorized the state intelligence agencies to require a telecommunication equipment vendor to plant backdoors or disable the communications of its customers. So Huawei has no obligation if there is any such request. And secondly, this does not apply to entities or subsidiaries outside of China. So it's only within China. And then this applies to other foreign companies doing business in China. So their subsidiaries in China. So basically Huawei, within China, Huawei has the same obligations with other foreign companies or their subsidiaries based in China. And then they also said the law stated if the National Intelligence Agency go beyond their authority or abuse their power, infringe upon organizations or citizens' legitimate rights or interests, they shall be investigated. So this is the national intelligence law. And then, of course, the second part of that is the anti-terrorism law. And the communication operators and internet service providers shall provide technical interfaces or decryption and other assistance to the government authority to do terrorism-related investigation. So under this law, only the operators in China, not the equipment vendors, need to provide technical assistance. And this kind of law exists in Europe and US as well. So when the law enforcement agencies ask the US companies to assist from a technical perspective, the US companies or European companies will need to assist as well. So I think just the bottom line is, Huawei there's no Chinese law that forces Chinese companies to plant backdoor to eavesdrop. And Huawei has no obligations, and then Huawei has the same obligation just as other foreign companies within China.
Okay,
David, can I get in one thing on this?
Please.
So look, I think that whole issue is simultaneously a red herring and speaks to why specifics often occlude the kind of ideological and geopolitical realities, right? Between the Cold War evolution of the national security state in the United States and close interlinkages between the Pentagon and Boeing and General Dynamics, and to some degree now with Oracle, Microsoft, whoever's providing the infrastructure for those systems, let alone NSA contracts with companies like Palantir. And I'm not saying this with any creepy, pernicious. I'm just saying this is the reality of how these things work. When there was a dictate of we need help identifying X, there was a domestic somewhat constraint about, we're not going to spy on American citizens, and the NSA can't do that, and the CIA can't do that. But in terms of asking companies for what essentially communications intelligence about what's going on abroad or working, conjointly, that's sort of par for the course, right? There's nothing so, and I do believe in the moral equivalency here. This is how countries guard their security. The reason why this becomes such an issue is because it's a seemingly non-ideological way to get into the ideological conflict part, which is Beijing's an autocratic, capitalist communist state, and the United States perceives itself as a liberal democracy, and so its potential interest in obtaining information is inimical to American interests and vice versa.
What sort of seems to be aggregating here, and I want to ask a couple of people to ask questions that are commenting very aggressively in the chat, is that the basis of this policy is not really facts for the most part and rational analysis, but more macro geopolitical concerns. I think that's coming through from a number of comments, but one of the things I wanted to ask Joy, which may reinforce what I just said, is to ask you, what has Huawei been told about why it is restricted from the US networks?
The US government really never told us about their concerns. We don't understand. I mean, this is the national security, but we really don't understand what the real issues are. There is no proof or evidence of Huawei's any wrongdoing. Huawei has been in the infrastructure business for 30 years. We work with pretty much all the top operators around the world, except the ones in the US, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint in the past. So we work with, Telefonica, Vodafone, British Telecom, and, American Mobile in Latin America, just about every operators in the large operators in the world. Huawei has never had any cybersecurity related issue. Huawei has been working with the UK government for the last 10 years. Every year, the UK, ongoingly, they monitor our source code and they do testing. And before these technology or solutions deploy to the UK operators, and every year they issue a report, and they never found any backdoor or any cybersecurity related issues. Of course, there are software improvement that we need to do, but UK government has been satisfied with Huawei's equipment and solutions. And we do similar things in other countries, Canada, Germany, and other countries as well. So Huawei's equipment is, is probably, our solutions are the most scrutinized and tested solutions in the world. So we hope we can figure out something to there are proven mechanisms elsewhere that can work. We hope we can figure out something for the US market.
Well, I think underscoring the interest in this topic and the value of dialogue, I have seldom in any session we've ever done seen a more aggressive and diverse set of comments in the chat than we have today, and really people from all different points of view. Somebody saying, the truth, to answer question one, it's about blocking competition. That's somebody named Greg. Mark Stallman, who is a longtime friend of Techonomies and of mine, says nobody in this group needs to know what has been discovered, but if I might paraphrase them, what the US government has discovered about the vulnerabilities of Huawei's technology. And so nobody here can really intelligently comment on that. But and I want to bring somebody on in audio in a minute too, who knows a little bit about that stuff. But Zachary, you made some points to me that if they really had evidence, you would think they would have presented it to other countries at certain international fora, right?
Scott may have some thoughts about this as well, but the fact is in March of 2019 at the Barcelona Mobile World Congress, when the United States government showed up and made what amounted to a relatively robust full court press about why it thought Germany and France and Europe and a whole slew of European allies should be on the same page about equipment, the reaction in those arenas was that none of what was presented in a classified setting to those allies made the case to them. So, you're totally right if someone says, look, none of us have seen the intelligence, and all that's true. All I can say is that people I know who saw the intelligence, and also wide reports from that Congress, was that the intelligence offered was not much more evidentiary than the generalizable, we think that this would provide the Beijing government with an undue advantage in tapping in private communications. And one final point on that, and someone in the Indian national security establishment remarked once why they wouldn't listen to that total ban, because they concluded that if we buy equipment from China, the Chinese will spy on us. If we buy equipment from the Europeans or the Americans will spy on us. Somebody is going to spy on us, regardless of the hardware. And the best we can do is try to mix and match our hardware to make it more complicated for anyone to easily spy on us.
Interesting. Scott, what would you say about this stuff?
Well, I mean, on the back door, I just, frankly, if you have a front door, you don't really need a back door. And the level of control that the government in China exercises over its companies is what it is. And I mean, Zachary's completely right that U.S. companies, I think that's a red herring as well, frankly. I mean, and where U.S. policy comes from, I'm not trying to defend U.S. policy as coherent, but I think the place that it mainly comes from is, I would trace it to a 2015 official Chinese document, which laid out the government's own ambitions for telecommunications around the world. And that it's just a couple of paragraphs, and it starts with space, with the Beidou system, which is now fully operational globally as an alternative to GPS. Then it goes into laying underwater fiber optic cables around the world, and so on and so forth. And then you get into service providers, you get into e-commerce companies, you get into anything you want. I mean, the strategy that was laid out 6 years ago was to create what is essentially a Chinese-run alternative, soup to nuts, space to underwater telecommunication system. And why would you want to do that? I mean, it's the goal is to make China as invulnerable as possible by creating a global system, and then it can bring as many people as it can, other countries and markets, into that system. So, just as an example, there's a lot of efforts that AliExpress and Alibaba have made in order to improve transport and logistics to bring Chinese products into Eastern Europe and into Europe. So the navigation signals for that will come from Beidou. To some degree, they already do. And you can imagine a system where you have essentially a globalization through all of this network that is nonetheless the information all has to pass through China. And that gives you a tremendous amount of control. And that is Chinese strategy, and they're executing on it. I mean, I would say that probably the worst thing about American strategy with regard to China is that it's kind of making its own nightmares come true. I mean, the more you isolate Chinese tech companies, the more the government sort of keeps them at home. And as Joy said, now Huawei's getting more of its revenues from the China market than it did from overseas, which is a departure from, I think, the last 12 or more years of Huawei's revenue mix. So I think the longer term implication of that is that China tech companies are going to be developing more and more for a Chinese market. And that's going to make it harder for them to innovate in markets outside of China, because they're going to be suiting Chinese needs. And maybe there will be a sort of further moment when those companies, having honed themselves again on a protected and very large market where foreign competitors are rigorously and have been rigorously excluded, then they might be able to take the advances that they come up with for the Chinese market and use them in other markets. That's exactly how Huawei initially expanded overseas. That's how Alibaba did it. That's how Didi did it. That's how all of these big tech platforms and tech companies in China have been able to become major multinationals. I mean, that's the remarkable thing, is that China's been able to build this sector out of virtually nothing in 20 to 25 years, and now has global scale companies and global ambitions. But ultimately, I would say that China wants to have control over these systems from space to underwater and everywhere else. And there's no sign that it's departing from that. So that's point number one. And point number two, again, is that the government of China has not in any way hidden its ability to influence Chinese companies to do what it wants when it wants to. And I don't see either of those changing. And I think ultimately the country that's going to lose from this is China, for the reason I just described. But I think that will probably take a while unless there's a change in Chinese policy.
Joy, any response on any of that? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick note on the telecommunication equipment. I think Huawei is an equipment vendor. Once we deliver the equipment to the operators, we actually relinquish the control of the equipment and network. So the operators around the world, they spend millions of dollars on IT and on monitoring on people to make sure the information flowing through the network is safe and secure. So every time if Huawei needs to do any upgrade or maintenance on the network equipment, we have to secure operators' written approval before we access these equipment. And our engineers will be using special provision laptops or computers provided by the operators, so they can only access the network for that specific upgrade or maintenance purpose during that specific time frame. And the operators, every keystroke of our engineers' work is logged with operators, and it's fully auditable. And they know exactly what Huawei engineers are doing on their network. And so if there's anything abnormal happens, they will immediately find out. So there's no way Huawei can, do any spying work or any illegal work that are not permitted by the operators. So what I'm trying to say is that because these are quite complex technologies, a lot of people don't necessarily have this kind of in-depth knowledge on the networks. So they think Huawei can just access the network at any time without any approval. That is absolutely not true. So the operators has full control of the information and the network.
I wanted to bring a couple of audience members on by audio who've said various interesting things.
Hi, David. Thanks. My name's Sean Kinney. I'm an editor with RCR Wireless News. Joy, Scott, Zachary, thank you for the conversation. I was just curious to hear your thoughts. This maybe moves away from the security piece, but we've been tracking sort of this long-term trend around hardware-software disaggregation. Zachary, I think it kind of speaks to your anecdote about the commentary from mixing and matching, making spying more difficult regardless of who's doing it. But from my perspective, this makes the business models of Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, ZTE, and Samsung all a little riskier when you shift from monolithic network stacks, proprietary equipment, towards multi-vendor software packages on commodity hardware. So just curious if you had any thoughts on what that trend might imply for the US, China, and even broader kind of economic and tech angles.
Thanks for that, and thanks for being here. Yeah.
So, Sean, I assume part of what you're alluding to is open radio area networks and virtualized radio area networks. And it's a really interesting thing in sort of the geopolitics of the tech economy, right? Because the amount of investment that's going into those kinds of advances, which as I think you mentioned disaggregation, I mean, essentially what ORAN proposes to do is to avoid dependency on the soup to nuts providers we've been talking about, Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung, ZTE, and Huawei, and to disaggregate that stack so that different providers can provide at different points along it, rendering the hardware relatively dumb and operating the network through software. So what's kind of interesting about that, and maybe ironic, is that I think a lot of the investment into that has come out of the conflict between the US and China in particular over the last 5 years. And Rakuten in Japan is the leading example, but there are other examples where a whole shift in the market and in the technology has been driven by this problem of having 5 providers who can do a 5G ready telco system with all the antennas and the software and everything. So, I mean, I don't, it's a good development. It would be really good if the networks around the world did not have to depend on these 5 providers, and it might even be a bit of a relief to some of those providers. So I think that's actually very hopeful, but I do think it's important to recognize that grew up, to some extent in reaction to this kind of potential impasse that's created by trying to force markets and to choose between the 5 incumbent providers.
Okay, a couple other people I want to bring on just to make comments, and we just have a little bit of time, so I'd urge everyone to be as succinct as possible in their questions and responses. But I'm going to let Jim Moore. Oh, Jim Moore cannot be. Okay, Jim said a bunch of things. He was saying that 5G is intrinsically more secure by its definition because of time slicing, and that it's more transparent because of the open software used to create it. I guess we're going to not hear from Kevin, unfortunately. That's a shame. But he also, forgive me, Scott, but he was saying, you don't appreciate the need for globalization to save the planet, and that the open source and open science movements are critical for global progress. I think that would be a general statement he would make. I don't know.
Well, one I entirely agree with, except the part about my underestimating it.
Well, go ahead. Yeah, feel free to say what you want.
No. Well, I mean, I just think it's inarguably true. I mean, the only real escape that a globalized tech culture has from these kinds of pressures is, its tradition of cross-border communication, and open source is part of that. I mean, there's a transparency within the sort of wider geek and academic world that's been its saving grace, and that has always been the force that I look to for transparency and relative freedom of communication, and the degree to which it can continue to be independent of states is the really interesting and crucial part. I hope that it can. I'm not sure that there's too much states can do really, except not to overly surveil and crush innovators in their own countries and abroad. But the reality is that no one state, and not even China or the U.S., is able to innovate sufficiently at a level to to keep the tech system growing and the networks growing around the world. So there is a dependency that states have that extends beyond their borders, and that's a really good thing.
Good. Well, we're going to have to wrap soon. I want to hear all 3 of you kind of closing comments about where this is all leading us. But just, I was going to bring on Tony O'Driscoll, who's a professor at Duke, but we just don't have time. And he was very clear in his question. So his point was one that we sort of have talked about, that isn't this all going to lead to the US falling very seriously behind in 5G? And that's a significant blow to the US.
I mean, I'd like just, very quick, and then I'll also use this as my wrap up. It certainly has led the United States to being slower and more costly in the rollout in the next 3 to 5 years. The flip side, it's also had a somewhat, and this speaks to what Scott's talking about, constructive effect in spurring alternate solutions and somewhat more investment that might otherwise have been made. So it's not all one or the other. I think the larger issue, and again, I'm with Scott in this more than I had thought we might be, which is that the competing ecosystems being isolated from each other is likely a long-term innovation drag on everybody. That doesn't mean that each society won't get away with it. It just means that it won't be as productive as it otherwise might have been.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about the supply chains per se, but that's a comment on that, right? The more you don't allow them to function the way that markets might like them to function, just because of supply and demand, the more you're basically hurting everybody to some degree. Is that sort of what you're saying, Zachary?
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially beggaring thy neighbor in a global tech fashion.
Yeah,
it's
and
suboptimal.
Well, and just to go to this point about saving the planet, 5G's promise in large part is that it's going to enable a much more aggressive monitoring of societal function in order to save energy. I mean, that is something many people argue. And so, Scott, any thoughts about is there any chance this is going to get better, or is Huawei cut out forever, and it's just going to be we all figure out how to sort of deal with the consequences that we've been describing here?
I think China is going to continue to isolate its own companies. I think it's going to continue to protect its own enormous market. And I don't see that changing. I mean, I think in the case of the US, the US, both at the governmental level and especially at the Silicon Valley level, overestimated the degree to which having a global internet that was more or less not interfered with by governments meant that the layers on top of that would also, be effectively eternally globalized. And which is why we don't have a Samsung or an Ericsson or a Nokia in the United States. I mean, it's not like we couldn't have, and there are large parts of some of those companies that were bought from American companies that built them, like AT&T, and were purchased from Google and so on. So honestly, I think that the US and Silicon Valley had a somewhat hubristic faith in that aspect of globalization, and China's response has been to undermine that faith, and that's continues to be a result of Chinese policy, and the U.S. is now embracing it. But I think the U.S. is incapable of moving towards a kind of tech autarky in the way that China wants and is doing for itself. Ultimately, I think that means that China, in responding to Tony's point, I don't think that the U.S. is going to, lose the 5G race. I mean, the U.S. tech companies will be very much part of it all over the world. I do think, and I'll end on this, I do think that the U.S. government under this administration needs to think a lot more about those markets that, Huawei and ZTE built at an attractive price point in Africa and Latin America and other places. As I said earlier, the US is, as Zachary pointed out, US companies, almost more to the point, have just kind of neglected those markets, and US government policy has neglected those markets. And I think that they need to do that differently.
Thanks. Yeah, there's the comments, the interesting comments are still flooding in. Before we go to Joy for closing thoughts, Chetan Sharma, who's one of the leading analysts of the telecommunications industry, just wrote in a chat that it's too complex and multidimensional to be handled in an hour, but he'd love to have future sessions, and maybe we'll ask him to be on one of them because he really knows a lot. He says the US is really not that far behind. It is actually making more money from 5G than China. That's interesting. Love to know more about that. He said there's a lot of hoopla in media about the topic. Difficult to separate the reality from the noise, but I think he thought we did a little bit of that here today. Joy, so what would you have us take away from this, from your perspective? And let me just ask one specific question too. Does Huawei have any hope that this situation could improve?
We hope the situation, of course, we hope the situation will improve. But we continue to evaluate our current businesses and expand our business in areas that we can continue to grow and survive. And I just want to maybe leave two numbers for the audience to consider. One is based on a research of Charles River Associates. If Huawei is not involved in the US 5G market, it will shrink US GDP by up to $241 billion in the 6-year timeframe. This is because the slow deployment of 5G and the impact on other industries. And then the second number is really about the semiconductor industry. We have a global supply chain on semiconductor based on the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA's number. They estimate building a regional self-sufficient semiconductor supply chain will take an incremental upfront investment of at least $1 trillion. So this will increase the semiconductor prices 35 to 65%. And then this cost will eventually be passed down to the consumers. So there's really not in anyone's interest to develop their own semiconductor supply chain, either by US or by China or any other regions. So, we need to work collaboratively across the world. I think that's really what we hope to see is really the technology diplomacy. The private sector and the public sector can come together to work on innovation, on fair competition, and also on building trust. That's what we really hope to see.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you to all three of you. We have so many more issues here we haven't been able to touch on. I hope that all of the audience, with their very, very diverse and much conflicting points of view, will all agree at least that transparency in the form of conversation about all this is beneficial. And I really thank all three of you for bringing your expertise to us today, and thank you to Huawei for partnering on this. And for those, Rob Enderle, hi Rob Enderle, and he's commenting. Kendall, reach out to him if you didn't already. But there is a private session after this for our members and speakers. So if you're not a Techonomy member, we'd love to have you do that. Josh, maybe that was what you came on to say. So go ahead, and sorry I went over a little bit, Josh. I know you like to end on time.
No, thanks, David, and thanks, Joy, Scott, and Zachary. It was a great conversation. It was great to see how engaged the audience was in the chat. So really love those conversations, much more similar to how we're used to our physical events and sort of the discourse and exchange of ideas. So as David mentioned, we have a member event following this. So if you're not a member, we'll be sending information about future member events. So we hope you'll join us. And again, we'll hope next week we'll launch the third iteration of our Health and Wealth of America event that will start next Tuesday. We have an amazing lineup spanning everyone from economists, business leaders, technologists. So you'll probably be seeing that. So we hope you'll join us
Nobel
next
Prize
week.
winning economist Joe Stiglitz, and also Dambisa Moyo, who didn't get a Nobel Prize, but she's very interesting.
Right. So really, again, appreciate you giving us the time today, and we'll hopefully see you at an event soon. The content from this session, the video, and we'll be writing, some additional editorial will be published. So hopefully you'll share that with your communities. And we'll see you hopefully next week at Health and Wealth.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
thank
you.
you to all of the
Bye.
very engaged
Let's make
audience.
it longer next time.
Thank you, David.
Next time we'll have to make it longer. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Zachary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.